The Galactic Council had existed for 12,000 years, and during all that time it had ruled over 47 different species who had learned to travel between the stars, and the council members believed they were the wisest beings in the entire galaxy, and they made laws that everyone had to follow without question. And they met in a giant building made of crystal that floated in space around a dead star at the very center of the galaxy, and the building was so large that it could be seen from millions of miles away, and inside this building, the council members would gather to discuss important matters and make decisions that affected billions of lives across thousands of worlds. Humanity had only been part of the council for 200 years, which was not very long. Compared to the other species, and the older alien races looked at humans as children who did not understand the proper way to behave, and humans had spread out across space very quickly, and they had built colonies on 80 different planets, and they had more than 12 billion people living on these worlds, and the human population kept growing every year, and they needed more space and more resources. And this made the older council members nervous because humans did not always follow the rules that had been in place for thousands of years. Commander Alex Murphy stood in the council chamber, and he was there to represent all of humanity, and beside him stood Dr. Helen Carter, who was a scientist that studied alien life. And next to her was Admiral Peter Grant, who wore his best military uniform and had medals on his chest, and the three of them had been ordered to come to the council to answer questions about what humans had been doing in the outer rim of the galaxy. And the outer rim was a place where the council had forbidden anyone to go for 10,000 years, but humans had gone there anyway. And they had built settlements and started families and created new homes on planets that nobody else wanted. The council speaker was a being made of living crystal named Crystallix the Eternal, and its voice echoed through the huge chamber like thunder. And it said that humanity was accused of breaking Galactic Law 742, which was about colonizing forbidden zones, and the humans had built colonies in places they were not supposed to go, and this was a serious crime that could not be ignored. And all the council members stared at the three humans with angry eyes, and some of them made hissing sounds, and others clicked their claws together, and the tension in the room was so thick that Alex could feel it pressing down on him like a heavy weight. Alex stepped forward and tried to explain that the worlds humans had settled were empty, and nobody was using them, and the human people needed places to live and raise their children, and they had checked carefully and found no evidence that anyone had claimed those planets before, and it seemed like a waste to leave perfectly good worlds sitting empty when people needed them. But the council did not want to hear his explanation, and they did not care about human needs or human problems. Counselor Vex was a reptilian creature with scales that gleamed like metal under the lights, and he had been one of the main writers of the council laws, and he spoke with a voice full of contempt, and he said that the law did not require previous claims, and the outer rim was forbidden because it was close to something called the Dark Zone, where terrible creatures called the Devourers were sleeping, and these Devourers had not been seen for thousands of years, but the old stories said they were monsters that ate everything in their path, and by going to the outer rim the humans had put everyone in danger, and this was unforgivable. Helen spoke up, and her voice was calm but strong, and she said that humans had been living in the outer rim for 3 generations, which meant almost 90 years, and during all that time they had never seen any sign of these Devourers. And maybe the stories were just myths that people told to scare children, and maybe the council just wanted to keep the younger species afraid, so they would obey all the rules. But this made the council members very angry, and they started shouting in many different languages and making sounds that showed their displeasure. And Admiral Grant just stood there watching everything with cold eyes, and his face showed nothing. Crystallix raised one of its crystalline arms, and the chamber became silent. And then it announced that the council had already made its decision, and humanity would have to withdraw from all outer rim colonies within 1 year. And furthermore, humans would not be allowed to build any new colonies anywhere for the next 500 years. And this was their punishment for breaking the law, and the judgment was final. Alex felt like someone had punched him in the stomach, and he knew that 500 years was an impossible amount of time for humans to stop expanding, because the human population grew so fast that they needed new worlds every 10 years, and without new colonies there would be overcrowding and poverty and suffering for billions of people, and children would grow up without hope, and the dream of humanity reaching for the stars would die. And he tried to find words to explain this, but his throat felt tight. Admiral Grant finally spoke, and his voice was quiet but dangerous like a snake about to strike. And he asked what would happen if humanity refused to obey this order, and the question hung in the air, and everyone in the chamber stopped moving, and even the air seemed to stop flowing, and all eyes turned to look at the three humans standing in the center of the room. Crystallix glowed with a dark light and said that if humanity refused, then they would be expelled from the council completely, and declared to be outlaws, and every other species would have the right to take human worlds for themselves and all. Human trade routes would be closed, and human ships would be attacked on sight, and humanity would stand alone against a hostile galaxy with no friends and no allies and no protection. And this was the price of disobedience. Alex took a deep breath and thought about all the human children living on 80 different worlds, and he thought about families who had built lives under alien suns, and he thought about the hopes and dreams of 12 billion people who just wanted a chance to live and grow and be free. And he thought about the Council's arrogance and their ancient prejudices and their fear of what humanity could become, and he made his choice, and he said that humanity needed time to bring this decision to their government, and they would need to discuss it with their leaders. Crystallix agreed and gave them 30 days to return with an answer, and the Council expected humanity to comply with their demands and obey like good children. And then the three humans turned and walked out of the chamber, and their footsteps echoed in the sudden silence, and not one council member noticed the small smile on Admiral Grant's lips, or the way his hand touched the communication device on his belt. And as they left the building and boarded their shuttle to return to human space, Helen grabbed Alex's arm and asked what they were going to do, because Earth Command would never accept this punishment. Alex said quietly that he knew this would happen, and Admiral Grant stopped walking and turned to face both of them. And he said they were going to do what humanity did best, and they were going to show the Council why you should never back a human into a corner, and there was something in his eyes that was both frightening and reassuring at the same time. And as their shuttle flew away from the crystal building and headed toward human territory, none of them saw the first distress signal. That was coming from the outer rim, where something ancient and hungry had finally woken up after sleeping for 10,000 years. The message went out from Earth Command through secret channels that only humans could access, and it was sent to every human colony, and every human ship, and every human outpost scattered across 80 different worlds. And the message traveled faster than light through the communication networks that humanity had built. And when people opened the message, they saw just 3 words that would change everything. And those words were maintain absolute silence. And everyone who read it understood what it meant. And they knew that something big was happening, and they needed to trust their leaders. The human delegation left the Nexus station without saying goodbye to anyone, and they packed their belongings and boarded their ships and flew away into space. And they did not send any messages back to the Council, and they did not make any statements. And they did not try to negotiate or argue, and the Council members thought this was strange. But they assumed the humans were just being dramatic, and surely they would come back soon with their answer, and surely they would agree to obey the Council's decision, because what other choice did they have? Days passed, and then weeks passed, and still there was no word from humanity, and the Council kept waiting for some kind of response. But none came, and human merchant ships continued to fly their normal routes, carrying cargo between worlds, and human colonies kept functioning normally with people going to work and children going to school, and everything seemed peaceful and ordinary. But every official communication channel remained completely silent, and it was as if humanity had decided to pretend the Council did not exist anymore. Counselor Vex became more and more agitated as time went by, and he kept asking when the humans would respond, and he said they must answer because they only had 30 days. And the deadline was approaching fast, and he could not understand why. They were being so quiet, and he thought maybe they were trying to trick the Council somehow. But he could not figure out what their plan might be, and this uncertainty made him nervous and angry at the same time. On the 29th day, Crystallix called an emergency meeting, and all the Council members gathered in the crystal chamber, and Crystallix said that the silence from humanity had to be interpreted as refusal, and since the humans would not obey, then they had to be punished, and the Council had no choice but to follow through with their threat, and so they took a vote. And it was quick and unanimous, and humanity was officially declared to be outlaws, and all their assets were frozen, and all their trade agreements were canceled, and 3 Council species that lived near human space were given permission to seize human colonies for what they called protective custody. The Zelthian Empire was the first to move, and they sent 200 warships to a system called Proxima, where humans had an agricultural colony that grew food for other human worlds, and the Zelthians expected to find a few patrol ships, and maybe some frightened colonists who would surrender quickly. But when they arrived, they found Admiral Lisa Bennett waiting for them with the entire Fifth Fleet. And the battle began immediately. And the Zelthians had more ships, but the humans had better tactics and better training, and 11 minutes later the fight was over. And the Zelthian fleet retreated with 70% of their ships destroyed or damaged, and not a single human vessel was lost. The Korthian collective tried a different approach, and they decided to send ground troops instead of ships. And they landed on the mining colonies in the Kepler cluster, expecting to capture the facilities and take control of the valuable minerals. But when their soldiers landed, they found the mines were empty, and all the colonists had been evacuated, and the Korthians thought they had won easily until they tried to leave and discovered that their ships had been sabotaged by human engineers, who had quietly planted devices that disabled the engines, and now the Korthian troops were stranded on the planets with no way to get home. The Vryn Concordat thought they were smarter than the others, and instead of attacking directly, they decided to blockade the human trade routes and prevent supplies from reaching the colonies, and they thought this would starve the humans into surrender within a few months. But what they did not know was that humanity had been preparing for this possibility for decades, and every human cargo ship had hidden weapons built into the hull. And when the Vryn ships tried to stop the cargo vessels, the humans fought back with surprising firepower, and the blockade collapsed after just 3 days. Back on the Nexus station, the council members watched the reports coming in with growing horror, and they could not believe what was happening, and they had expected humanity to be weak and helpless. But instead, the humans were defeating every force sent against them, and some of the counselors started to whisper that maybe they had made a terrible mistake, and maybe they had underestimated humanity very badly. Admiral Peter Grant could have explained to them why they were losing, but nobody from the council had bothered to ask him. And the truth was that humanity had spent 200 years studying every species in the council and learning about their weapons and their tactics and their weaknesses, and humans had been fighting each other for 10,000 years before they ever reached space, and they understood war in ways that the peaceful council species had completely forgotten. But humanity still said nothing, and they made no demands, and they did not threaten anyone, and they did not try to negotiate, and they just defended their worlds and protected their people, and the silence was somehow more frightening than any threat could have been. And the council members started to realize that maybe silence was its own kind of message. In the deep parts of space far away in the outer rim, the distress signals were getting stronger and more urgent, and the human colony on a planet called New Dakota stopped sending regular reports, and then the settlement on Frontier's Edge went quiet, and then the mining operation on Last Hope disappeared from all communication networks, and something was happening out there in the darkness, and it was getting closer. Crystallix received the reports about the missing colonies and read them with growing dread, and the energy signatures matched descriptions from the ancient texts, and the patterns were exactly like the old stories described, and the Devourers had awakened from their long sleep, and they were starting to move, and they were hungry after 10,000 years of waiting. A Thessian counselor named Ixthar stood up and said that the council must warn humanity about what was happening, because whatever their differences, the humans deserved to know that the Devourers were coming, and they deserved a chance to evacuate their outer rim colonies before it was too late. But Vex slammed his clawed hand on the table and said no, and he said the humans should face the consequences of their actions, and they had colonized the Forbidden Zones, and now they could deal with what they had awakened, and the council should let them suffer. The vote was close, but the warning was never sent to humanity, and the council members told themselves that the humans had brought this on themselves, and they deserved whatever happened to them, and they tried to ignore the guilt that some of them felt deep inside. On a human world called Haven, a colony administrator named Dan Cooper received an urgent message from Earth Command telling everyone to evacuate immediately, and the message did not explain why, but it was marked as highest priority. And Dan looked at his wife Karen and their 2 children, and he started organizing the evacuation, and they were lucky because they made it to the transport ships and escaped before the Devourers arrived. The colony on New Georgia was not so lucky, and by the time the evacuation order reached them, it was already too late, and 8,000 colonists died in a single night, and the automated distress beacon sent out images that would give nightmares. to anyone who saw them, and the images showed massive creatures that were part machine and part living flesh, and they consumed everything in their path and left nothing behind but bare rock. The Devourers had been sleeping in the dark zone for 12,000 years, and humanity's presence in the Outer Rim had been like an alarm clock waking them up, and now they were awake, and they were moving, and they were heading not just toward human colonies but toward the entire civilized galaxy. And the Council did not see it yet because they were too busy focusing on humanity. And humanity still said nothing to the Council, but in secret military bases and hidden command centers, the humans were preparing, and they were getting ready not just to defend the Outer Rim, but to face something much bigger. And Admiral Grant stood in front of a holographic map showing the whole galaxy, and he pointed at the black areas where the Devourers were coming from. And he said quietly that the creatures were not just coming for human colonies, but they were heading straight for the Nexus, and the Council was in their path. The Devourers hit the Council's border colonies like a massive wave of destruction, and the first place to fall was a listening post that belonged to the Vrin Concordat on the edge of the Dark Zone, and the automated systems managed to send back 3 seconds of video before everything went dark, and those 3 seconds were enough to show everyone what they were facing, and the images were terrifying beyond anything the Council had imagined. Counselor Ixthar watched the footage in the Council chamber, and her skin turned a sick shade of green, and the Devourers were exactly like the ancient texts had described them, and they were massive creatures that looked like a horrible combination of machines and living things, and each one was as big as a city block, and they could eat matter and turn it into more of themselves, and they moved through space like a swarm of insects, and they stripped planets bare of all life and left nothing behind except dead rocks floating in empty space. Crystallix asked how many of these creatures were coming, and its voice was shaking, which was something that had never happened before, and Ixthar replied that the sensors had detected at least 10,000 in the first wave, but they were making copies of themselves, and every world they consumed gave them more material to build new Devourers, and the numbers would keep growing and growing until there was nothing left to stop them. Vex for once had nothing to say, and his reptilian face had gone pale under his scales, and he realized that maybe the Council had made a terrible mistake by not warning humanity, and maybe they should have worked together instead of fighting, but it was too late now to change what had been done. The Council mobilized every defense fleet they had, and they called upon all the ancient treaties that bound the member species together, and 50,000 warships assembled at a place called the Kelvin Line, which was the designated defensive perimeter, and it should have been enough, because the Council had sophisticated weapons and energy shields that could withstand the heat of stars, and targeting systems that could track something as small as a grain of sand from 1,000,000 miles away. But the Devourers did not care about any of that, and they just kept coming forward like nothing could stop them. And the Battle of Kelvin Line began, and it lasted for 6 hours, and the Council fleet fought bravely, and their ships filled space with enough firepower to crack a planet in half, but the Devourers simply absorbed the energy and adapted to it and kept moving forward like nothing had happened. When the defense lasers proved ineffective, the Council switched to kinetic weapons that fired solid metal at high speeds. But the Devourers' armor just shrugged off the impacts like they were nothing. And when they tried quantum torpedoes, the Devourers somehow phased through the explosions without taking damage, and every tactic that the Council species had perfected over thousands of years was completely useless against these ancient monsters. Fleet Commander Thane was a Zelthian who had survived the disaster at Proxima, where his fleet had been defeated by Admiral Lisa Bennett, and now he watched his tactical display with growing horror as every strategy failed and the Devourers were learning and adapting and evolving in real time, and they were getting better at fighting with every minute that passed. Thane gave the order to fall back, and all the remaining ships retreated toward the Nexus station, and they left behind the wreckage of 8,000 ships and millions of dead crew members, and the Devourers did not chase them immediately because they stopped to consume the debris in the bodies, and they grew stronger with every piece of matter they absorbed. In the Council chamber, panic replaced the usual order, and representatives shouted over each other, and some wanted to evacuate while others demanded impossible solutions, and Crystallix tried to maintain control, but even its eternal composure was cracking under the pressure, and the ancient being that had led the Council for centuries was finally showing fear. Ixthar said quietly that they needed help, and only Crystallix heard her over the noise, and Crystallix asked from whom. even though it already knew the answer, and Ixthar replied that there was only one species in the galaxy with the military, coordination and ruthlessness to fight the Devourers, and that species was humanity, who they had declared outlaw just 37 days ago. Krystallix's form dimmed with sadness, and it said that humans would never help them now after what the Council had done to them, and Ixthar replied simply that if humans would not help, then everyone was dead, and there was no hope left for any of them. But even as the Council descended into chaos, something strange began appearing on their long-range sensors, and the sensor operators reported ships approaching, and hundreds of them, and then thousands of them, and all of them were broadcasting human identification codes, and the human fleet was arriving, even though nobody had asked them to come. Admiral Peter Grant stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, which was the newest and most powerful warship in the human arsenal. And around him on holographic displays were the faces of every ship captain in the assembled fleet, and there were 3,000 warships ranging from massive dreadnoughts to small nimble destroyers, and all of them were ready for battle. Grant asked for a status report, and Admiral Susan Blake's face appeared, and she said the 7th Fleet was in position, and they were reading Council ships in full retreat, and the Devourers were consuming the Kelvin Line stations and everything in that area of space. Lisa Bennett chimed in and said the 3rd Fleet was ready, and they had analyzed all the data from the Battle of Kelvin Line, and the Devourers were using adaptive shielding, which meant that energy weapons became ineffective after the first contact, because the creatures learned how to defend against them. Grant said, then they would not give the Devourers a chance to adapt, and he ordered them to execute something called Protocol Nightmare, which was a human innovation born from centuries of warfare on Earth, and it was simple and brutal and effective. And humanity had learned long ago that the best way to fight an adaptive enemy was to hit them with everything at once and overwhelm their ability to respond. The human fleet split into 3 groups, and the first group was heavy dreadnoughts carrying experimental weapons, and they jumped directly into the Devourers' formation, and before the creatures could react, the dreadnoughts fired kinetic kill vehicles, which were massive slugs of tungsten metal accelerated to a fraction of light speed, and there was no energy to absorb, and no shields to adapt to, and just pure kinetic force, and the first wave of Devourers shattered into pieces. The second group was fast attack cruisers that swept in from the sides, and they deployed a weapon the Council had banned 3,000 years ago because it was considered too cruel, and these were nuclear-shaped charges designed not to explode outward, but to focus all their energy into a single point, and the charges were wrapped in antimatter containment fields that collapsed on detonation, and the second wave of Devourers simply ceased to exist. The third group hung back and analyzed the Devourers' response patterns and fed data to the combat artificial intelligence systems, and when the Devourers tried to adapt and change their configuration to defend against kinetic weapons, the humans switched tactics immediately and hit them with particle beams and plasma torpedoes, and it was like a deadly dance where humanity was leading. On the Nexus station, the Council watched in stunned silence as the humans did what 47 civilizations could not do, and they were actually fighting the Devourers to a standstill and holding the line. And Vex whispered, "How is this possible?" And his arrogance was finally broken. Ixthar, who had studied humans more than most of the Council, answered softly that humans had been fighting each other for their entire history, and they knew war in ways the Council had forgotten, and also because humanity had come to help even after the Council had betrayed them and tried to destroy them. The battle raged for 3 days without stopping, and the humans lost 400 ships and thousands of crew members died. But they held the line and protected the Council worlds, and the Devourers, for the first time in their ancient existence, were forced to retreat back into the Dark Zone. As the last of the Devourers disappeared back into the Dark Zone, Admiral Peter Grant opened a communication channel to the Nexus station, and his face appeared on every screen in the Council chamber, and he looked tired, but unbowed, and he said that the immediate threat had been neutralized and the Council people were safe for now, but he emphasized the words "for now" because everyone needed to understand this was not over. Krystallix found its voice and said that the Council thanked humanity, and after what the Council had done to the human people, they had no reason to help, but they came anyway, and Krystallix's voice was filled with shame and regret. Grant's expression hardened, and he said that no, the humans did not have any reason to help, but that was the difference between humanity and the Council, because the Council saw humans as a problem to be controlled, while humans saw the council species as people worth saving even when they did not deserve it. The council chamber fell completely silent and nobody dared to speak. And Grant continued and said that this was not over, and the devourers had retreated, but they would be back stronger and more numerous than before because they had tasted what was out here in the galaxy, and they were hungry and everyone needed to talk, and all of them together. And this time the council was going to listen to what humanity had to say. Vex started to object out of old habit, but Crystallix cut him off with a sharp gesture and asked when and where they should meet, and Grant replied that they would meet on neutral ground, and the human colony ship Wanderer had been converted into a mobile conference facility, and it was already on its way to their position, and they would meet in 48 hours. Grant leaned forward and his eyes were hard like steel, and he said that the council should bring everyone and there would be no more secret votes and no more backroom deals, because humanity had just saved their civilization, and the least they could do was treat humans as equals. And then the transmission ended. For a long moment nobody in the council chamber spoke, and then slowly Ixthar began to click her mandibles together, which was a sound her species made to show respect, and one by one other counselors joined in with their own gestures of acknowledgement. And even Vex, with his pride completely shattered, bowed his head in acceptance. 2 days later, the conference chamber aboard the Wanderer was deliberately designed to make a point, and where the council chambers had been grand and imposing and designed to make visitors feel small, the human ship's meeting room was functional and plain, and there was a large round table in the center with every seat at exactly the same level, and there were no elevated platforms and no hierarchy, and just equals sitting around a table. The council representatives arrived in small groups, and many of them were seeing the inside of a human vessel for the first time, and they noticed the efficiency of the design and the lack of decoration, and the crew members who moved with military precision, and they realized that this was a species built for survival, where every inch of space had a purpose. Admiral Grant waited until all 47 council representatives had taken their seats, and he stood at the table, flanked by Alex Murphy and Dr. Helen Carter. And behind them, holographic displays showed the current position of the Devourer, forces, and the defensive lines that humanity had established. Grant began without any polite introduction, and he said they needed to be clear about why they were here. And he said that 37 days ago, the council had tried to destroy humanity, and they had attempted to steal human colonies and blockade human trade and leave humans to die, and they had failed, and then the Devourers came and humanity saved the council anyway. And now everyone needed to understand something fundamental about humanity. He pressed a button and the displays changed to show Earth's history with images of wars and empires rising and falling and cities burning and being rebuilt, and humanity clawing its way up from caves to the stars. And Grant explained that humans had been fighting for survival since they learned to make fire, and they had faced extinction a dozen times and came back stronger every single time. Grant said that the council thought they could intimidate humanity with isolation and economic pressure, but humans had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars and their own nuclear weapons, and the council's sanctions were just an inconvenience and not a death sentence. Helen stepped forward, and her voice was softer but no less firm, and she said that all that fighting and all that survival had taught humanity something the council had forgotten, and she said that sometimes the only way to survive was to work together, and every major advancement in human civilization came when they stopped fighting each other and focused on a common goal. And that was why humans were here, even after what the council had done to them. Alex took over and said that the Devourers were not going to stop, and their analysis showed the creatures were not just mindless consumers, but they were strategic, and they had retreated to assess and to adapt, and they would be back in force within 3 months, and when they came, no single species could stop them, and not even humanity alone could defeat them. The holographic display shifted and showed projections of the Devourer advance, and the numbers were staggering because the creatures had consumed enough matter to replicate themselves 100-fold, and the next wave would be unstoppable by conventional means. Crystallix spoke, and its voice was humble for the first time in anyone's memory, and it asked what Grant proposed, and Grant answered with one word, and that word was integration. And he explained that he did not mean council oversight with humanity as a junior member, but true integration, where there was a combined military command with representatives from every species, including humans, and there would be shared technology and shared intelligence and shared sacrifice. The chamber erupted, and several counselors objected immediately, and they cited thousands of years of protocols and traditions, and Vex was among the loudest, even though his voice lacked its former authority, and he said that Grant was asking them to abandon everything they had built. Helen countered, and said that the council had not maintained peace by preventing anyone from becoming strong enough to threaten them, and that was not the same thing as real peace. And the council had kept younger species weak and rationed out technology and enforced arbitrary rules to maintain control, and that system was about to get everyone killed. Admiral Susan Blake, who was participating through a holographic link from her flagship, added that they had analyzed the Devourer's capabilities, and the creatures were not natural, and someone had made them and engineered them as weapons, or possibly as terraforming machines that went rogue. And either way, they were specifically designed to counter the kind of static defensive strategies the Council favored, because they adapted too fast, and the Council needed offensive capability and unpredictability, and they needed what humanity brought to the table. Ixthar stood up, and her multiple eyes reflected the light of the holograms, and she said that she spoke for the Thessian Combine, and they voted yes to integration because the humans had saved their colony ships when their own fleet abandoned them, and humanity had earned their trust. One by one, other counselors stood, and the Corthian collective, who had been humbled by their defeat in the Kepler cluster, voted yes, and the Vryn Concordat, whose pride had cost them their entire blockade fleet, voted yes, and even the Zelthians, who were traditional allies of Vex, voted to accept humanity's proposal. When it came to Vex's turn, he remained seated and his claws gripped the table, and he said that Grant was asking them to give up their sovereignty, and Grant replied quietly that no, he was asking them to survive, and there was a difference. The vote was called and 43 species voted yes and 3 abstained, and only Vex's faction voted no, and the measure passed, and over the next 6 weeks the galaxy transformed in ways nobody had imagined possible. Human engineers worked alongside council technicians, and they combined technologies in ways neither had thought of before, and the council's advanced energy systems were integrated with human weapons platforms, and council shields that were once thought impenetrable were reinforced with human ablative armor, and human tactical doctrine merged with council strategic planning. On Earth, a lieutenant named Jake Morrison led a training program for council officers, and he taught them the kind of rapid response combat that humanity had perfected, and on the Thessian homeworld, Helen Carter worked with their scientists to understand the Devourer's biology and search for weaknesses. The cultural exchange was jarring for both sides because council species learned that humans could be stubborn and irreverent and willing to question any authority, while humans learned that the council species, despite their apparent weakness, possessed knowledge and wisdom that came from thousands of years of civilization. On the Nexus station, which now served as headquarters for the Combined Defense Force, Admiral Grant stood with Crystallix, and they reviewed the defensive positions together, and the ancient being had changed since that first meeting, and its crystalline structure seemed less rigid and more adaptive. Crystallix said that it owed Grant an apology, because the council had judged humanity unfairly, and they saw human youth and aggression, and assumed humans were dangerous, and Grant replied that humans were dangerous, but danger was not the same, as evil and a knife could kill, but it could also save lives in the hands of a surgeon and The second battle for the galaxy, as it would come to be known, lasted 17 days, and those were 17 days of continuous fighting across a front that spanned 400 light-years, and it was 17 days where every tactical doctrine, and every strategic plan and every technological innovation was tested to its absolute limit, and nobody who fought in that battle would ever forget what they saw and what they did. The Devourers came in waves, and each wave was more numerous than the last, and they had grown strong from consuming the debris of the first battle, and they had replicated themselves until their numbers were almost beyond counting. But they found an enemy unlike any they had faced in their ancient programming, because the combined fleet did not fight like the council species of old, who stood in rigid defensive lines, and instead they fought like humans had taught them, by flowing and adapting, and striking from unexpected angles and retreating before the Devourers could learn their patterns. Jake Morrison commanded a mixed squadron of human destroyers and Thessian frigates, and they had trained together for 6 weeks, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, and when his ship took critical damage on day 3, a Thessian captain named Velthar positioned her vessel between Morrison's destroyer and the Devourers, and she took the hits that were meant for him, and Morrison returned the favor 2 hours later when Velthar's shields failed. By day 7, the casualties were mounting at a terrible rate, and 3,000 ships had been lost along with crews numbering in the millions, and the Devourers were adapting faster than anyone had anticipated, and they began targeting command ships because they recognized that severing communication would fracture the fleet's coordination and break their unity. The Defiance was hit on day 9, and a Devourer construct that was larger than any seen before broke through the defensive screen and rammed directly into the flagship, and Admiral Grant was thrown from his chair as the bridge decompressed and emergency bulkheads sealed automatically. But the damage was catastrophic and alarms were blaring everywhere. Someone shouted that the Admiral was down and they needed medical help immediately. But Grant was already pulling himself up, even though blood was streaming from a gash on his forehead, and he wiped his eyes and demanded a status report. The tactical officer reported that engines were offline and weapons were at 40% capacity, and the ship was dead in space and sitting helpless. And around them the battle continued to rage, and if the Devourers concentrated their forces on the disabled Defiance, it would be over. Grant opened a channel to all ships and said that nobody should break formation to help them, and the fleet needed to hold the line no matter what. But help came anyway, and not from human ships, but from a council vessel, and it was Crystallix's own flagship, which was a massive crystalline construct that had never seen combat before, and it moved to shield the Defiance from the attacking Devourers. The speaker's voice came over the communication channel and said that they were going to tow the Defiance out of danger, but Crystallix was staying to hold the position, and someone needed to protect this part of the line, and Grant protested and said that Crystallix's ship was not designed for combat, but the ancient being replied that it was time the council learned to fight, and humanity was not the only species that could adapt. The crystalline ship engaged the Devourer construct in single combat, and bought precious time for the Defiance to be pulled to safety, and Grant watched on his tactical display as Crystallix fought with courage nobody knew the being possessed. And the crystalline ship used its unique properties to refract and redirect Devourer energy attacks, and it was beautiful and terrible to watch. The crystalline ship held for 11 minutes before it finally shattered into a million pieces, and Crystallix died. But the Devourer construct was destroyed, and the Defiance survived, and the loss of the council speaker sent shockwaves through the entire fleet. The death of Crystallix galvanized everyone who was fighting, and species that had been rivals for thousands of years fought side by side with renewed fury, and the Zelthians and the Korthians and the Vryn, all of them channeled their grief into devastating attacks against the Devourers, and they fought harder than they had ever fought before. On day 12, Helen Carter made a breakthrough while working with Thessian scientists, and she had been analyzing the Devourer's molecular structure for days, and she found an anomaly that nobody had noticed before, and the creatures were not just adapting to threats individually, but they were networked together and sharing information instantaneously across their entire population. Helen explained to the fleet commanders that this networking was the Devourer's greatest strength, but it was also a vulnerability because if they could overload the network with contradictory data, they could create a cascade failure that would affect all the Devourers at once. Admiral Susan Blake asked how they could do that, and Helen said they needed the Devourers to adapt to multiple incompatible threats simultaneously, and they needed to hit them with energy weapons and kinetic weapons and nuclear weapons all at once from every direction, and each attack had to be different and unique, and they would overwhelm the creature's processing ability. It was a desperate plan, and it would require perfect coordination from every ship in the fleet, and one mistimed attack would cause the whole strategy to fail, but they were losing slowly and inexorably because the Devourers were grinding them down through sheer numbers, and they had no other choice. Grant, who was commanding from a secondary bridge on the Defiance, made the decision, and he broadcast to all ships that they were going to execute something called Operation Chaos, and every vessel would select a unique weapon configuration, and no two ships would fire the same way, and they would hit the Devourers with everything at once in complete disorder. And human chaos was about to become a weapon. The fleet repositioned itself, and 9,000 remaining ships arranged themselves in a sphere around the Devourer formation, and every weapons officer checked their configurations carefully and made sure they were different from every other ship, and Grant gave the order, and the galaxy lit up with fire. Energy beams and plasma bolts and kinetic slugs and nuclear warheads and antimatter torpedoes and graviton pulses and weapons that had not been used in thousands of years, all fired simultaneously, and the Devourers caught in the center tried to adapt, and their network went into overdrive attempting to process thousands of different threats, and each one required a different defensive response. For 3 seconds it seemed like the Devourers were going to succeed, and they were adapting and their forms were shifting and changing to counter each weapon type. But then the cascade failure began, and unable to reconcile the contradictory defensive configurations, the Devourers' network collapsed and units stopped responding, and some began attacking each other and others simply froze. Grant ordered a second wave, and they poured everything they had into the attack, and this time the Devourers could not recover. And like a house of cards, the entire formation collapsed, and 100,000 Devourer constructs were reduced to inert debris in a matter of minutes. The fleet held its fire and waited, and sensors strained to detect any remaining threats, and minutes passed. And then hours, and the Devourers were gone, and not retreating or regrouping but completely destroyed, and a cheer went up across the fleet, in a dozen different languages, and for a brief moment the weight of 17 days of hell lifted from everyone's shoulders. But the cost had been terrible, and 6,000 ships were lost, and millions of people had died, and entire species had lost significant portions of their populations, and the council chamber on Nexus Station would need to be rebuilt, and there was an empty space where Crystallix had stood for so many centuries. In the aftermath, the survivors gathered for a conference, and this time it was held in open space with representatives on their own ships, looking at each other through holographic projections, and it seemed right somehow because this was a new kind of council for a new galaxy. Grant spoke first, and his voice was rough with exhaustion, and he said they had won, but they needed to be clear about what that meant. And the Devourers were gone. But there would be other threats, and the galaxy was bigger and more dangerous than anyone had known, and they could not go back to the old ways. Ixthar, who was now the acting speaker, nodded her agreement and said that the old council was dead, and Crystallix had sacrificed everything to teach them that lesson. And she proposed a new organization called a Federation, where all species would be equal and all voices would be heard, and humanity would be included not as subjects but as founders. Vex, who had been humbled and changed by the battle, spoke up, and his voice lacked all its former arrogance, and he said that he had fought the hardest against humanity, and he had been wrong, and he had let pride and fear blind him to what humans could offer, and he formally apologized to the human species and pledged his people to this new federation. The vote was unanimous, and the Galactic Federation was born with its founding principles, drafted by humans and council species working together. And the first law was simple, and it said that no species would ever again be silenced for speaking inconvenient truths. 6 months later on Earth, a memorial was unveiled that listed the names of every human who had died defending the galaxy, and all 847,000 of